They gave me 30 days to leave the house my husband and I had built together. That line still sits in my throat like a stone. It came wrapped in polite sentences and a practiced look from Sydney, the eldest, the one who always carried himself as if he owned the room. Edwin stood beside him, quieter but with a speed in his smile that made my hands go cold. Between them they moved through the living room like men who had rehearsed this moment, measuring curtains with their eyes, remarking on the car in the driveway, congratulating me on how tidy everything still looks. They talked about logistics and inheritance, as if I were a piece of furniture they were arranging. When they finally said it, "We want the estate, the business, everything," it landed heavier than Floyd's absence. Floyd had been gone 3 weeks. The house still smelled faintly of his aftershave, and there was a coffee ring on his desk that I could not bring myself to wipe away. For 22 years we'd shared the ordinary architecture of life, small fights about the thermostat, stubbornness over paint colours, late-night plans that turned into quiet compromises. He was not extravagant, he was precise. The company he'd built was part stubbornness, part genius, and it had been ours. What they meant by everything included the house, the business, and the small retirement accounts that to them looked like a prize. The first attorney we saw, Martin Morrison, did not sugarcoat it. He sat across from me in his office, bookshelves, diplomas, the faint smell of coffee, and told me, with that careful professional voice, the consequences of contesting a will. The cost would be high, the timeline would be long. The sons had leverage, they were already in the house, they were controlling the utility payments, and there were hospital bills that had stacked up into the 6 figures. 180,000, he said. My mouth went dry. It was the number that felt like a trap. Owe enough and you become small. Contest it, Martin said, and you fight on 2 fronts, probate and public perception. It's not impossible, but it's expensive and uncertain. It was also, he added, humiliating in a quiet sort of way. People will take sides, he said, looking at me with sympathy I didn't ask for. And grief makes people reckless. He didn't sound like he thought I had options. That afternoon, when Sydney sent me an email with a thin list of terms and a deadline stamped in the subject line, I sat in the kitchen and stared at the screen until the words blurred. That night I walked through the house as if I were trying to find a fault line. I ran my hand along the back of Floyd's leather chair, the one that held the exact imprint of his body. The lamp on his desk cast a small pool of light on a surface littered with receipts, business cards, and a stack of mail I hadn't had the heart to open. I hated that he was suddenly a question mark. I hated that his sons, men I had known for years, the children of a marriage that was supposed to have its own decency, had turned to predatory precision in the space between grief and paperwork. It was a small key, tucked in an envelope at the bottom drawer of his desk, that shifted everything. I had to fish it free. The drawer resisted at first, as if the house itself didn't want its secret revealed. The envelope was unassuming, unmarked, the kind that could have held a grocery list. Floyd's handwriting on the corner was the thing that made my chest tighten. Loopy, deliberate, the way he wrote when he was thinking. No note, just a single brass key. It was nondescript and warmed from his touch, as if he'd held it often. I let it rest against my palm and felt, for the first time since the funeral, something tighten that wasn't grief. Curiosity. A memory of his habit, his way of planning for inconveniences I didn't know he foresaw. I did not tell Sydney or Edwin about the key. The next day, with Martin's regret hovering at the edge of every practical conversation, I drove to the bank that had managed Floyd's accounts for years. The building was smaller than I expected, the sort of place that preferred a quiet reputation and hands-on service to flashy marketing. Patricia, the manager, knew all of us by sight. She had greeted Floyd with an easy smile whenever he came in to put in checks or ask for advice about the company's cash flow. She ushered me into a small back room with a safe and a counter where rubber-stamped signatures meant more than online forms. The light in there was low and intimate, the air-conditioned hum a steady witness. I placed the brass key on the counter like a relic, like the thing it had become. "I don't know what to expect," I told her. My voice sounded small. "He kept this in his desk. There's been some disarray with the accounts and the estate, and..." She nodded. People like Patricia are used to inventorying absence. She handled the key as if she recognized it, or recognized the way such things change hands. Let's see, she said. Do you have ID? She didn't ask for more than was proper. She watched me with clinical sympathy and procedural detachment. We walked through the vault door into a room that smelled faintly of metal and old paper. Racks of boxes and rows of safety deposit lockers made the space feel like a map of a life measured in tiny compartments. Patricia found box 412, slid a key, and a lid creaked open with the sort of finality that sounds louder than it should. Inside were several manila envelopes and a small leather folder. The envelopes were labelled in Floyd's careful hand. Tax 18, legacy notes, personal. My fingers trembled. The room felt like the inside of his head. I pulled the leather folder free and opened it. There, neatly placed, was a stack with printed emails, bank statements, a report, Coulter private investigations, a neurologist consultation, and at the bottom, a will, not a photocopy. Someone had gone to the trouble of printing a final executed version. The paper had the soft weight of permanence. The first page was an email thread. It was terse, clinical. Names I recognized, Sydney, Edwin, appeared in a way that made my stomach drop. I read that exchange quietly and felt the world tilt. The emails didn't scream. They suggested. There were references to loans that weren't documented in company minutes, mentions of accounts where funds had been transferred in ways that left little corporate paper trail. There was a tone, casual, entitled, that turned an ordinary sentence into proof of something deliberate. One message in particular, an attachment labelled Line Item Reconciliation, had a shorthand that matched deposits into a personal account that Floyd had always said was restricted for company use. That account, the statement showed, had been leached in ways that made my head swim. Next came bank statements. They were not neat. Several accounts bore transactions that pulled funds in directions I couldn't reconcile. One was a retirement account that showed a recent and large transfer into a trust structure that my name wasn't listed on. Another was an account in Florida with wire transfers I didn't recognize. The numbers were just numbers. Until they were not. They began to sketch a pattern. Clandestine loans, withdrawals timed around certain dates, transfers that smelled of desperation. Then there was the PI report. James Mitchell's prose was clean and less elegant than his legal colleagues, but it was thorough. He had followed receipts, tracked timestamps, and interviewed a clerk at a small landscaping company who confirmed receiving checks tied to Edwin. Mitchell's report contained a paragraph that made me swallow, documentation of forged signatures on an invoice, a mismatch in notarizations, a voicemail where Sydney pressured an accountant to move this through. The report didn't say, they stole. It said, evidence suggests unauthorized transfers and potential forgery. That was enough to be dangerous. That was enough for any sensible person to choose compliance over resistance. Finally, there was the neurologist consultation. Floyd had visited Dr. Klein twice in the last year. The notes were clinical and compassionate. Dr. Klein had found no cognitive impairment. She wrote that Floyd was capable of making financial decisions and understanding the consequences. The Sun's version, whispered in corners, insinuated as reason for their sudden control, relied on an unspoken argument that grief equates to vulnerability. The doctor's note undercut that version with quiet authority. At the bottom of the pile, beneath the medical and financial paper, lay the will. My hands, which had been steady through most of the reading, took their time with this document, as if reading it would change it. It was dated weeks after Floyd's last hospitalization, signed and witnessed. The lawyer's seal was embossed in the lower corner. I let my eyes move over the preamble, careful instructions, distributions, a few specific bequests to nieces and employees, and then, like everyone who has ever held the thing that decides futures, I looked for the line that mattered. There it was, on the third page, in a line so simple it could have been a note in a journal. I read it aloud, because reading aloud staked the sentence in the room, made it real. I leave the decision of distribution of my estate entirely to my beloved wife, Colleen. The sentence was not an ultimatum or a flourish. It was a hand placed on my shoulder after all those years of being unseen. It was Floyd, in his precise way, choosing to vest agency where the family's greed had expected to dictate. For a moment I felt dizzy, like the room had spun an inch and set everything true. I did not know then whether the will alone would be enough to stop the machinery turning against me. A signed page can be powerful, but power often needs proof. That proof sat around the will in a scatter of paper, the emails, the bank transfers, the PI notes. Taken together, they made a case that did more than instruct. They threatened exposure. If a religious person would put it another way, it was a moral summons paired with legal leverage. "You understand what this means?" Patricia said softly, when she saw my face. She'd been watching without comment. "This is not the usual wear and tear of family affairs." "Yes," I said. Saying it felt like stepping onto a ledge. "But I do understand." I left the bank with the folder clutched to my chest. The house seemed different on the way home, like a stage where actors were waiting for direction. It had been 3 weeks since the funeral. Grief was a raw, omnipresent thing, but something new had threaded through it. Agency, yes, and a curious relief that Floyd had left me the very instrument I needed. I thought of the little brass key warming my palm, of how it had fit into a lock I hadn't known existed, and of the way he had always planned for contingencies the rest of us couldn't see. Back at the house, I spread the documents on Floyd's kitchen table and let them sit in their honest, terrible order. Each sheet of paper was a small witness to the life he'd planned and the life they'd tried to unmake. I fed myself on small, practical rituals. Coffee made too weak, letters thumbed through, calls returned with new calm. The Sons called that evening. Sydney's voice was polite with an edge. "We're just trying to be reasonable, Mom," he said, which was the way he always spoke when he wanted to sound calm. Edwin was quieter but persistent. "Emily's coming by," he mentioned, as if to signal backup. Bianca's name came up too, the wife who wore expensive shoes and smiled with an economy of expression I'd come to know as predatory. I told them my visits to the bank. I watched for the moment their demeanour shifted. For a breath they were smooth and casual and utterly certain. Then, without drama, I said, "I found a will." There was a pause. It stretched long enough to pull a picture of a courtroom into my head. "Which one?" Sydney asked, voice flat and controlled. "The last one," I answered. It felt like a small stone thrown into a still pool. On the line between us, the ripples moved. It would have been easy that night to let them steamroll me, to sign whatever documents they slid across the table the next time they forced their way into my kitchen. It would have been sensible, in the way Martin had explained, to bargain for certainty rather than fight for principle. But the thing about being on the receiving end of a plan is that sometimes the plan is exactly what you need to mirror back at those who think themselves entitled. Floyd, in his quiet, organised way, had left instructions with a test. Place the choice not with the presumptuous heirs, but with the person who had spent decades beside him. I did the sensible thing and called Martin. I told him I'd found documents, and I told him which ones. He asked a professional list of questions, the date on the will, the witness names, whether the paper bore a lawyer's seal. When I told him the sentence, his voice altered from cautious to engaged in a way that felt like relief. "If it's authenticated," he said, "and if the other documents corroborate misconduct, there's leverage for negotiation. This could be settled without a contested probate if your sons accept reasonable terms." That night, in bed alone, the house full of the absence of the man I had loved, I replayed memories that suddenly read like clues. Floyd at his drafting table, blueprints splayed and a pencil behind his ear. His habit of writing notes to himself in margins, little reminders that his sentence was meant to be used long after he was gone. The way he would say, half joking, "People are never as bad as you imagine, until they show you they are." He had always been precise, but there had been a ferocity under that precision, a desire to protect what mattered without spectacle. Maybe he had thought his sons would be different. Maybe he had known they wouldn't. Either way, the brass key and that small, decisive sentence felt like a hinge he'd left for me to find. I slept badly. But the next morning I was awake with a clarity I hadn't expected. There is a kind of grief that narrows you to a single task, and suddenly I felt shaped for action. I made a list, Not of all the legal things, not of potential courtroom strategy, because Martin would do that, but of the practical order of operations. Authenticate the will, secure the documents, determine which assets were liquid and which were tied up, and crucially, find out what the sons had already done. The PI report suggested some of this, but the board of the company would need to be informed. There were employees to consider, and pensions, and a legacy that was not just ours, but belonged to the people who had worked for Floyd for years. Before I left the table, I put the will inside a plain folder and slid it under the stack of other documents. There is an odd intimacy to holding a document that determines futures. It felt like holding a compass. Outside, the weather had turned cool, a Pacific breeze threading salt through the neighbourhood. The house had always faced west, and from the porch I could see a sliver of ocean where the sky touched the water in a sort of promised horizon. It was the view Floyd had liked best. He would take his coffee out there on mornings when the world was generous. I stood for a moment and thought of all the ways he had tried to keep us steady against storms. When I drove into town that day, I stopped at the small cafe where, years ago, Floyd and I had celebrated the first contract that changed everything for the company. The place was a capsule of memory, stained menus, a chalkboard with the day's specials, the barista who knew our order without asking. I took a table, ordered black coffee, and opened the folder again. Reading those documents in public made me feel both exposed and strangely armoured. I began to mark, light pencil strokes at the margins, numbers that would matter, names that would need to be spoken in a formal way. Martin called at noon. He wanted copies and the originals for his review. "We'll have to move carefully," he said. "We need to make sure everything is authenticated, and that the executors you'll face, your sons, if they attempt to act, are bound by law before they can do more harm." "Can they?" I asked. "Act now? They can attempt," he said. "But attempts sometimes have to go through formal processes. If Floyd put this clause in place, it changes the posture completely. The key is to control information, rather than let them set the narrative." His voice carried the tone of someone used to wrestling with delayed justice. At that moment, I felt the other half of Floyd's plan. Not only the sentence in the will, but the quiet dossier he had apparently assembled. It was one thing to have the authority to decide. It was another to have proof enough to make anyone accept that decision. The emails and the bank statements were like a map. The PI's notes were the tracks. I needed to make sure those tracks were visible to the right people. A thought that had been circling found its way into a sentence. If I had the will, and if I had evidence, the choice of inheritance could be ours to wield, not with cruelty, but with direction. There are ways to arrange consequences that do not humiliate, but do bring about justice. Floyd would not have wanted spectacle. He would have wanted right. That afternoon I rang the number on the PI report and left a message for James Mitchell. The investigator's voice on our first call was direct. He said he'd done the legwork. He had receipts, recordings, and interviews. He'd also kept copies of everything, as investigators do. He asked if I wanted his help presenting the findings to Martin and to the board. "I don't do settlements," he said, then paused and added, "I do evidence." It was a strange relief to hear him say that. Evidence is a kind of truth that courts and boardrooms respect, even when hearts balk. The notion of truthless accusation had gnawed at me since the funeral. Now, for the first time, I felt like I had something that could stand in a room and point. That night, the sons were back in the house, acting as if the estate had already learned to bend to their will. Edwin left a set of keys in the hallway that rattled against the doorknob in a way that felt deliberate. I pushed back against the instinct to throw them into the trash. Instead, I folded them into a small dish and put them away, where they would not be used as leverage but would remain honest markers of possession. I wrote a short letter to Floyd that night. It was not something I intended to show anyone. I told him about the key and the way the brass fit into my hand. I told him about the sentence and how it felt like his voice reaching across a silence. I told him I intended to do what he would have wanted, to see that the company and the people who had built their lives around it were protected. Grief teaches you a vocabulary of small acts: paying a bill, calling a neighbour, taking the dog to the vet. Power teaches you another: gathering papers, securing witnesses, aligning the facts. I found myself flipping in and out of both of these languages. At times I would sit and remember the laugh that rolled out of Floyd when he had a plan worked to perfection. At others I would be pinching the edge of a bank statement and trying to do the arithmetic of leverage. 2 days later, with the will secured and the copies made, I met Martin at his office. He had with him a fresh legal pad and a cup of coffee that steamed in front of him like a small altar. We went over the documents in a practical, sober way. He advised that we not broadcast the existence of the will until we had an authenticated copy and a strategy to manage the initial confrontation. I understood why. An uncontained truth can be weaponized. He also told me in a quieter moment that Floyd's sentence was unusual but not unheard of. It gave discretion to a named individual rather than to a trustee or executor. "It's clean," he said. "It gives you authority to make distribution choices within the estate. That matters." "What if they don't accept my choice?" I asked. The question had been at the back of my throat for days. "They can challenge it," he said, "but a duly executed will is a powerful instrument, and if your choices are backed by evidence of misconduct, their options shrink." He didn't say prison or ruin. He offered only the narrow map of legal posture: challenge, negotiate, settle. It was the language of restraint, and I liked it. On the way home, I stopped at the company to see Anna, the office manager who had worked with Floyd for 15 years. She greeted me in the front reception desk with the frankness of someone who had seen power tilt before. She handed me a ledger and told me quietly that she had noticed some transfers that required explanation. "We keep things tidy," she said. "Doc like tidy." Her voice held the same kind of grief I'd come to know, precise and practical. She had not seen the will, but she had a worker's sense of what documents looked like when they were tampered with. Over the next week, I moved like someone possessed by quiet urgency. There are small logistical things in estate work that are curiously domestic: making copies, advising employers, sorting through old bills. There are other things that require a different kind of attention: conversations with the bank manager about freezing certain accounts pending probate, a call to the accountant to make sure payroll would continue, an appointment with a notary to remedy an awkward gap in documentation. Each step felt like winding a spool that had earlier become tangled. I was never alone. Martin called. James replied with timestamps and transcriptions. Patricia left a voicemail to confirm she would retain the documents and prepare an authenticated copy of the will for probate filing. The sons noticed the shift before I did. Their tone changed in our conversations. Sidney started to speak in shorter sentences, as if he were measuring his words against new, unseen walls. Edwin stopped sending casual texts about selling the lake house. They began to ask for meetings guardedly, offering to work things out without specifics. They smelled the change in the air before I spoke it aloud. On a wet afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and read the will again. Words, once printed, become scaffolding for decisions. Entirely to my beloved wife, Colleen. I whispered it the way I might whisper a prayer, and felt the syllables land with a strange sort of justice. Floyd had given me a choice. The sentence was his last gift in a currency he knew how to mint. Simple, decisive, unshowy. I do not tell this part of the story to brag. I tell it because there is a difference between being the last person at a marriage's bedside and being the first person to find a way through the legal labyrinth that follows death. Grief can make you small, or it can sharpen you. I chose the latter because Floyd had given me the tool to do so. There was, of course, risk. There are always risks when you choose to confront. But risk without principle is only bravado. Here I had principle and an instrument to make the principle speak louder than the son's presumption. A week later, after sleepless nights and thin coffee, I signed the paperwork Martin required to begin formal proceedings. "We'll move quietly," he said. "We'll give them an opportunity to accept your terms. If they refuse, then their options will shrink." He did not promise victory. He promised steps. When I left his office, the sky over town had the brittle clarity of late autumn. The air smelled of rain and salt, and something that felt like possibility. I knew, with a settled terror, that the most dangerous part of the story had not yet begun. The parts that would test me, the confrontation, the negotiations, the temptation to make justice into spectacle, were still ahead. But standing there with the will folded inside my bag and the brass key heavy in my pocket, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. Later that evening, the sons came to the kitchen. We sat around the table where I had spread the documents like a map. I watched their faces, the practiced impatience in Sydney's jaw, the quick glances Edwin exchanged with Bianca, and knew that the room had become a courtroom in miniature. I placed the folder in the centre, and without theatrics said, "There's a will, and it names me as the person to decide distribution of the estate." One sentence. One small hinge that had turned a roomful of presumption into a roomful of negotiation. The consequences of that sentence were not automatic. They would need to be articulated, argued and defended. But as the voice that had loved him stepped forward, I felt not vindictiveness but fidelity. To Floyd, to the company he'd built, and to the people who depended on it. "If you want what you think you deserve," I said, "then you will have to accept the terms I decide." The men shifted. I could see calculations, of money, of reputation, of risk, moving across their faces like tide lines. There would be a meeting, they suggested, a conversation. They asked for time to consult advisors. I agreed to a date. It was, deliberately, the first move of many. That night, I sat alone on the porch and watched a small moon lift over the ocean. I had felt, in the days since finding the key, a strange steadiness that blunted the raw edge of grief. I thought about the foundation Floyd had once talked about, in a half-joke manner, a way of giving back once the work was secure. It had seemed fanciful then. Now it felt possible, less frivolous and more like purpose. If you've ever sat through the slow, humiliating erosion of what you thought belonged to you, comment me below. It helps to know you're not alone. Some questions still needed answers. Who among the company had been implicated by the transfers? How far did the sons' manoeuvres reach? Could evidence be presented in a way that forced them to choose without destroying the family or the business? Those were the practical knots I would have to untie. For now, however, the will's single sentence had given me an axis on which to turn. I went to bed with the brass key on my nightstand like a talisman. It had opened a lock, yes, but more importantly, it had unlocked a decision. In the quiet hours, I thought about the kind of justice I wanted, one that didn't revel in humiliation, but insisted on accountability. I thought about the workers whose paychecks depended on how this played out, the employees who had been loyal to Floyd through thick and thin. I thought about how easy it is for grief to be weaponized by those who will profit from it, and how rare it is for someone on the receiving end of grief to be given a real tool for protection. Morning came, as mornings do, and with it a list of practicalities. I would meet James to go over his report. I would allow Martin to file a notice so that potential creditors and claimants could be tracked. I would instruct Patricia to keep the documents secure and to prepare for the formal probate submission. I would invite Anna to a meeting to ensure payroll continued despite the turmoil. Each step was mundane in description, but monumental in consequence. That afternoon, James and I sat in a small room at the PI's office. He laid out the interviews he had conducted, vendors who received payments with suspect signatures, a bookkeeper who had been pressured to alter entries, a voicemail that captured a demand. Taken together, he said, the pieces formed a portrait of pattern and intent. He was careful with language, alleged, suggests, potential. But he did not hedge the essential truth. There was a pattern that, if presented correctly, would make the son's options painfully limited. "The more we can show this was deliberate," he said, "the less palatable their choice will be." I nodded. I had not come to punish. I had come to protect. Floyd had given me a sentence and, with it, permission to make decisions that might be hard on the men I had known. I would use it not to humiliate, but to balance scales that had been tipped by an assumption of entitlement. We left James's office with copies of transcriptions and a plan to coordinate with Martin. The next meeting would be the formal one, my first opportunity to speak with Sydney and Edwin under a framework that allowed me to present the will and the evidence in a single, contained moment. It would be the first time they would have to decide whether to take the properties they coveted, properties with mortgages and obligations attached, or to choose differently in the face of exposure. At the end of the day, I stood at the kitchen sink, washing a mug Floyd had always left with a lipstick mark on the rim. The ordinary act steadied me. The house, for all its legal peril, was still mine to inhabit. The documents were in place, the key was safe, and the single sentence in Floyd's voice had shifted the axis in the room. There was work ahead. There was danger and negotiation and the possibility of ugly exposure. There was also now a way forward that kept intact what mattered: the people who depended on the company, the legacy Floyd wanted to protect, and the quiet dignity of choosing right over easy. The next morning I would call the meeting. The moment of revelation was near, and the shape of what I would say had already begun to form in my mind, a direct, honest sentence that named what I had discovered and the choice they faced. I did not know how they would respond. I only knew that for the first time since his death, I felt capable of being the person Floyd had trusted me to be. The brass key burned in my pocket like a promise. The will's single line echoed in my head like a bell. I was ready to use both. The morning of the meeting felt smaller than I'd imagined. Not smaller in importance, nothing about that day was small, but in a way that made the event seem more human, more possible. Martin's conference room was glass on 3 sides, with a view of the courthouse clock and a smear of sky that promised rain. There was a polished table, water glasses, and an arrangement of documents laid out with a kind of brutal neatness that I recognised as comfort. James sat to my left, a slim stack of his reports bound with a black clip. Patricia had come too, not in a bank uniform, but in a plain blouse, her hands folded like she'd come to witness a necessary thing. Anna had sent a note she couldn't come and asked me to tell the employees she trusted that payroll and benefits would be safe if we needed to act quickly. They arrived together, Sydney and Edwin, their faces carefully arranged into a neutrality nothing in them earned. Bianca held herself in a way she'd learned in the country clubs she liked to mention, slightly apart, as if she could refuse the room's gravity by declining to lean in. They sat opposite me, with the practiced ease of people who believe a poker face can substitute for moral accounting. For an instant, I thought of the way they had moved through my living room 3 weeks ago, the way they'd remarked on curtains. Time had given me language they couldn't borrow. "Thanks for meeting," Martin said, and I heard the civility underneath which this was an exchange of leverage. He opened with the legal scaffolding. The will had been authenticated, the neurologist's notes confirmed capacity, the safe deposit box had been verified by the bank. He was careful with verbs. His role, professionally, was to keep everything tight. He had also, in the days since I'd found the will, quietly filed notices that bought me legal breathing room, certain accounts flagged, a notification to the company board, payroll protected to an extent the sons could not easily circumvent. He did not overstate our hand. He never would. He only set the table. I let him finish. Then I spoke. I had rehearsed parts of the speech in my mind, but when I began, the words came as if shaped by the documents themselves. "There's a will," I said. "It vests in me the power to decide how the estate is distributed." I watched them find their masks for the news. Sydney's jaw tightened. Edwin's eyes flicked to Bianca, as if to ask whether he'd misread the room. I did not read the whole will. I quoted the line that mattered, the line Floyd had left like a lever. He wrote, "I leave the decision of distribution of my estate entirely to my beloved wife, Colleen." The sentence sounded different in the conference room, as if the air accepted it and shifted around it. There was a stunned silence, one of those long, elastic pauses that in smaller lives end in laughter and in our lives meant a recalculation. Then Sydney's practiced calm returned. "We can work this out," he said, the way people say things they expect to be taken at face value. "We want what's fair. We can come to an arrangement that keeps things amicable." "Fair to whom?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but that quiet held a precise point. "To you, who moved money around without documentation? To the company employees who depend on regular pay? To the vendors who were paid late while funds vanished?" Edwin jerked forward like a man whose thought had been interrupted. "You don't know what you're suggesting," he said. "Those were transfers connected to operations. There are explanations." James slid a slim folder across the table toward me and did not look at anyone while he spoke. We followed transactions. We have timestamps, vendor interviews, copies of invoices with signatures that do not match the ones on file, and a voicemail recording of a call in which Sydney directed an accountant to reclassify an expense without board approval. He used cautious language, suggests, potential. But he also left a clear line. The documentary trail existed, and it wasn't flattering. At that, Sydney smiled with the empty charm of someone trying to reroute accusatory gravity. All of this is hearsay until a court says otherwise, he said. You're wielding a will like a club. You chose to put the choice in my hands, I answered. That was his will. This isn't about clubbing, it's about following instructions. I put my palm flat on the table, feeling the grain of wood through the fabric of my resolve. I will make choices that preserve Floyd's company and protect its people. I will not make choices that allow personal enrichment built on shaky or potentially unlawful transfers to stand. Bianca's mouth tightened, and she clicked a nail against a glass. So what are you saying? She asked. Do you expect us to be happy? To just walk away? I'm offering you options, I said. You can accept certain assets, with their obligations, as distributed by me, or you can refuse and we will seek legal remedies supported by the evidence we have. I let that hang. I did not say criminal charges with relish. I said it because truth had to be stated plainly. The PI's report and the bank statements created a credible threat of more than civil litigation. I did not need to boast. The files sitting beside me did the threatening. Martin leaned in. We will not pursue spectacle, he said, but we will pursue consequence. If your clients choose to contest, we will respond. If evidence of unauthorized transfers exists, it will be presented to the appropriate authorities and to the board. There are remedies that can include civil recovery and referrals to investigators. That's the landscape. For a moment I watched them count options the way players count cards. The Suns calculated reputational risk, financial pain, the possibility of a criminal record, the prospect of being cut off from a business they believed their birthright entitled them to. I thought of the ledger Anna had shown me, of employees who could be left adrift if someone ill-equipped to run a company inherited a house with lawsuits attached. I thought of the small hands of payroll. These decisions were not abstract. Sydney's voice dropped low and measured. You want us to accept properties that are financial burdens, he said, translating my general terms into a weaponized phrase. You're trying to make us take the poison. I'm trying to make choices that reflect responsibility, I said. If a property is encumbered with mortgages and liabilities, I can assign it to those who seek it. You take its obligations. You don't want it, you walk away with nothing. Or we take the route where documents are presented to authorities, and we let the court and potential prosecutors decide. Edwin's hand trembled where it lay on the table. He attempted a defence I had heard before in quieter forms. There are legitimate business expenses. People make decisions in the life of a company. Transfers, loans, reclassifications. You're missing context. I felt something in me settle, like the anchor of a ship finding a ledge. For 22 years, Floyd had taught me to place pieces on the board so the game moved toward what was right. He had given me a sentence to wield. Now it would be used not for spite, but for stewardship. You asked for specifics, I said. Here they are. I nodded toward James, who opened his binder and began to lay evidence on the table in a way that was calm and chilling. He did not theatrically slam documents down. He slid them in a sequence that built a pattern. There was the bank statement with a wire out on a date where payroll should have been made, an invoice for landscaping with a signature that did not match, a printout of a Florida account that had accepted periodic transfers. Each sheet was a quiet witness. Together they formed a portrait. This is not innuendo, James said. It's patterns. If we present this to a board or to an investigative body, the next step would be subpoenas, forensic accounting, and potential criminal referrals based on the evidence. I watched their faces change. Sydney's composure thinned, Edwin's jaw clenched. For the first time since their lines about, "we want everything," they looked uncertain, because legal processes are slow and patient, and they have a taste for the unprepared. I'm not here to ruin you, I said. I'm here to protect what Floyd built. I will make decisions that preserve the company, pay the bills, and ensure employees are safe, but I will not act as a doormat for anyone who took advantage of their position. Bianca's voice rose then, brittle and loud. You think you can hand us a house, then tell us to pay everything? That's extortion. Not extortion, Martin said evenly. Distribution under a will is not extortion. What Ms. Whittaker is offering are lawful distributions. The alternative is a legal process that will determine whether transfers were authorised and whether civil or criminal matters should be pursued. That's the choice. The sons consulted each other in a language of narrowed eyes and muttered words under breath. They pressed for delay, time to consult lawyers, time to review documents. Martin refused to grant delay beyond a reasonable window. He was generous, but not foolish. He had a duty to preserve the company's balance, not to let it be plundered while we waited for the sons to manufacture excuses. I watched them count their options like men counting the last bills in a wallet. Ultimately, calculation beat bravado. They did not relish choosing between a pile of assets whose edges were sharp with debt and the slow, messy possibility of legal exposure. They were, in the end, practical in the narrow ways that people used to expecting advantage are. They chose self-preservation. You'll take the properties, Martin said, sliding a draft of the distribution terms toward them. They are transferred as is, with encumbrances disclosed. You accept responsibility for mortgages, back taxes, and any outstanding vendor obligations tied to those parcels. You sign here to acknowledge you understand the liabilities. If you refuse, we will refer the matter to the appropriate authorities and proceed with civil actions. The estate will withhold certain funds pending resolution. There was a quiet, fast negotiation, less Shakespeare and more practical bargaining, about timelines, about which properties they intended to accept, and about whether they could be expected to cover certain debts immediately. I kept my voice even. I wanted them to know I was not vindictive. I wanted them to feel the moral weight of being asked to pay obligations they had helped create. Edwin, quieter than the rest, said, If we sign for the properties, will there be criminal referrals? Martin did not look at me. He answered the way lawyers do when they need to be precise. Evidence will be preserved and presented where appropriate. Signing for property does not erase investigation. However, a negotiated resolution can include releases for civil claims, subject to verification of disclosed liabilities, and can reduce exposure if fully complied with. That term set is negotiable within reason, but criminal matters are not the province of private settlement. He was careful. He left the possibility of criminal referral intact. He had to, because the evidence in James's report was that serious. They shifted. There was a low conversation between Sydney and Bianca that I could not hear in detail, but the outcome was visible. Resignation. No dramatics, no last-minute righteous stands. They signed pages that acknowledged the distribution terms. The way their pens moved was mechanical, as if someone else had pressed them with an invisible blade. When the final signature was made, when the ink dried like a small punctuation, the room exhaled with a variety of breaths: relief, defeat, calculation. Martin made a gentle but firm point. These agreements would be recorded, executed with clarity, and they would carry consequences if violated. I kept my eyes on the will, on the sentence that had given us this moment, the sentence that had turned agency into action. They left with faces that tried to be indifferent. Outside the glass, the courthouse clock chimed the hour like an indifferent jury marking time. Sydney had the look of a man who'd been forced into a decision he never wanted to be honest about. Edwin looked hollowed. Bianca drove off with an elegance that seems to say, I will bounce back. I did not hate them as they left. Hatred is a heavy internal burden. I had, instead, a steady, practical determination to repair harm. In the days that followed, the distribution we agreed on played out with a deliberate cruelty that was, in the end, practical justice. Properties were transferred to the sons with full disclosure of mortgages and liens. The sons inherited what they wanted, not as a gift, but as an obligation. They could keep them if they wanted. They could sell if they needed to. They could live with the liability they had, through their actions, helped create. It felt like the kind of accountability that doesn't parade a moral victory, but quietly requires responsibility. We used funds to pay the $180,000 in hospital bills that had threatened to make my life small. I set up a temporary fund to ensure payroll continued for the company. Anna stayed on as office manager. Floyd's employees came to work each day and were paid on time. That felt like a small miracle, one that had the ordinary face of bills paid and lights on. There was more negotiation with vendors and with the company's board. We had to decide, practically, who would run what. I took a leave from the company's daily operations long enough to stabilize the ledger, and then appointed an interim CEO who had a reputation for steady hands. The board accepted the appointments after seeing the evidence James compiled. Their loyalty to the company, not to familial ties, allowed them to act with the workers' welfare in mind. That, in the end, was Floyd's true legacy, a company that mattered to more than just a family's status. I did not take pleasure in the son's discomfort. There is a difference between pleasure and relief. My relief was not that they suffered, but that the harm they had wrought, intentional or thoughtless, could not continue to overshadow the broader community Floyd had built. When the transfers were reviewed by auditors, several anomalies were flagged for further inquiry. These were matters for authorities and the company to pursue. I left those prosecutors to their work without comment. My role had been to use the will and the evidence to keep the company whole and to compel accountability where necessary. That had been done. Selling properties was a practical, inevitably emotional act. We listed the lake house, the rental properties that had been turned into speculative holdings, the parcels that had been left half-finished. I watched a realtor wrap my memories in glassine and catalogue them for buyers who liked the idea of a perfect coastal view without the knowledge that it had once been a household full of small arguments about paint. The sales were not quick, because properties with unresolved liens make buyers careful. They took months rather than weeks. But with patience, most of them sold at reasonable prices after liens were cleared and obligations met. Money flowed to pay remaining debts, to compensate vendors, to cushion employee pensions. It was not an instant cure. It was a slow, deliberate mending. I remember one afternoon standing in a realtor's office, watching a buyer sign for the lake house with a certain bright-eyed belief that buying the view would heal him. I felt strange sympathy for him. Houses hold stories. Buyers come with illusions. The house was sold. The proceeds paid the mortgages and covered other claims. The estate was solvent again. It felt like a kitchen, with stains and with dishes, but the lights were on. As the months unfolded, the pressure in the house lessened. The sons retreated into a quieter life, occasionally showing up to retrieve boxes or to sign final documents. They did not, to my knowledge, mount a renewed legal battle. They were pragmatic enough to know that, in the face of documented evidence and a will that had placed the choice in my hands, continuing a fight offered them less than it cost. They had to live with the choices they had made. So did I. Justice had been meted in paper and signatures, not in spectacle. What I did with the money was deliberate. It would have been easy to sequester the funds in a bank account and live carefully by the sea. Instead, I chose to create something that would matter for others. Floyd had once joked about a foundation. I treated the joke as a promise. I set up a small legal and financial aid fund for victims of family financial abuse. We named it the Whittaker Legacy Fund, which sounded to my ear appropriate without being ostentatious. The fund's first priority was to fund counsel for people who could not afford to contest unfair transfers and to educate older adults about estate planning and financial exploitation. If there was any solace to be taken from what had happened, it was the knowledge that others could be spared the slow indignity I had endured. Patricia helped with a modest grant from the bank to seed the fund. Anna organised an outreach programme. James Mitchell agreed to serve on the advisory board because he believed in the work we were trying to start, and because, in the end, he is someone who believes in evidence shaping right action. Sarah Mitchell, James's daughter, reached out after hearing about the fund. She had been working in non-profit administration and offered practical experience that felt like a gift. She would become, quietly, the kind of person who could translate heart into process, exactly what the fund needed. Her steadiness and organisational skill made the fund real rather than symbolic. We opened a small office near the company's headquarters. We hosted workshops taught by accountants and lawyers who agreed, pro bono, to help those at risk of financial exploitation within families. We paid for initial consultations for people who could not otherwise afford them. The work was not huge at first. One person helped, then two, but the impact rippled. I wanted the fund to be practical, an answer, not a lecture. We helped a woman secure access to her own finances after a controlling partner had consolidated cards in his name. We helped a retired teacher reframe her will after a manipulative child tried to coerce a change. Each small victory felt like a balm. As the first year closed, I left the house and moved to a small home closer to the water, Carmel, not far but far enough that the coast could be part of my daily landscape. The house is modest, white paint flaking near the stoop, a kitchen window where I can watch gulls wheel, a small backyard that faces toward a canyon garden. I planted roses because Floyd liked roses, and because there is something dignified about putting bones into colour. The garden took up the slack of grief, and gave me something to tend with focused, uncomplicated effort. Dirt is forgiving in ways grief isn't. Plants respond to steady care. They do not carry memory the way people do. They ask only for light and water. My days began to find a new rhythm. Morning walks, foundation meetings, a light touch with the company board when they needed direction, and, in between, time to sit and read in a chair that didn't wear Floyd's imprint. I learned to listen for small things, the way a neighbour's laugh spilled over a fence, the rustle of a rosemary bush, the precise light before a storm. It felt indulgent and required all at once. I visited the company occasionally, always greeted with a kindness from people who'd watched the ledger be steadied and who had seen the payroll restored. Workers would stop me to say thank you. Their gratitude was not dramatic, but practical. Notes about paychecks, children returning to school on time, a landlord no longer threatening eviction. Those small consequences matter. Floyd had built this company with more than profit in mind. He had built it with people in mind. Protecting that felt like honouring him in a way the will had asked me to do. There were quieter moments, holidays and family anniversaries, where absence was weighable. I found new ways to remember Floyd that were neither private nor performative. I set a small plaque at the company entry commemorating years of service for long-term employees. The inscription was simple, for steadiness and craft. It felt right. Once, on a late spring afternoon, I received a letter from an older woman who'd attended one of the fund's workshops. She wrote in a bookish hand about how she'd been humiliated when her own son began to help himself to her accounts after her husband died. She said the workshop had taught her what to ask for and where to go for help, and that, because of a small grant from the fund, she'd been able to hire counsel to restore some access to her money. The letter closed with a line that made me stand still. "You took care of us when others took from us." I read it twice and felt like something closed with a neatness I did not expect. Not all endings are neat. There were still legal inquiries that crawled along, as they do, with the sluggishness of institutions. Some vendors filed claims that needed settlement. The sons occasionally surfaced in my thoughts, less as villains in my head than as people who had failed their better natures. I did not seek to erase them from my life. I refused to make them central either. They had been given a choice and had taken it. There is a morality to living with the consequences of one's decisions. That, in the end, was part of the correction the will had enabled. The foundation grew, as small organisations do. A donor here, a speaking engagement there. We published a short booklet on estate vigilance that the local library requested multiple copies of. I spoke at workshops about signs of financial coercion and the importance of securing clear documentation. People asked me what I had done. I always answered the same way, because it was honest. I found what my husband had left and chose to use it for the company, for the people, and for others like us. I spoke about the sentence in the will that changed the arc of our story. It was always, and will always be, a hinge. There are things I still do simply because I like them. I take my coffee out to the small porch and sit with the ocean visible in thin slashes between rooftops. Sometimes Sarah comes by, with a list and a steady smile, and we talk about a case or a donor or the new volunteer schedule. She brought by a small plant once, a succulent, and said with a laugh that nothing ruins it if you forget to water it for a week. She has become a quiet, reliable friend. James still calls occasionally, often to say something practical about a document, sometimes to offer a short, dry joke. Patricia visits when she is in town, and Anna sends updates on the company the way a friend reports family movements. Life rethreads itself in braided strands of small human acts. I think now about the single sentence Floyd left. It was modest in appearance, 16 words perhaps, but it had the gravity of a deliberate instruction. He could have set up a trust structure, appointed a corporate fiduciary, or named an executor. Instead, he gave his wife the decision. That choice required courage and trust. It required him to believe I would use discretion in ways that matched his quiet sense of responsibility. There is a particular kind of quiet triumph in honouring someone's intent without becoming consumed by vengeance. I kept my voice steady in meetings and my intentions clear. I used the will as it was intended, as direction for the future, not as a weapon for the past. People have asked whether I felt vindictive at any stage. The truth is that vindictiveness is a poor planner. It confuses satisfaction with justice. I wanted justice, the kind that repairs and protects, not the kind that makes headlines. When I think of that key tucked in his desk drawer, I smile in a private way. The key was small, unremarkable, warmed by his hand. It opened a safety deposit box, and more importantly, it opened a path. What I did with the documents, the will, and the responsibility Floyd gave me was deliberate. I chose preservation over drama, accountability over spectacle, repair over revenge. People sometimes ask, would you have done it differently if you hadn't found the will? It's a litmus test question, the kind that tries to trap decisions into hypothetical purity. I don't know. I do know that the available choices bend toward what is possible, and I chose the option that protected the most people. That is not always the easiest path, but it felt right. On warm afternoons I walk the path by the cliffs and think of how a sentence on a paper can hold more power than 1,000 angry voices. I think of how documents, then, can shape futures. I think of Floyd's hands as he laid that sentence down, the small pencil pressure he left on the line, the deliberate curve of his handwriting. It felt like a final act of strategy on his part, a way to protect a legacy without creating a spectacle. If you ever find yourself on the unpleasant end of someone else's assumptions, if you felt the slow tilt of entitlement, you understand how dangerous invisible things are, verbal claims, casual loans, the presumption of inheritance as a right rather than a responsibility. If you do not, consider this story as a caution. The things we steward are rarely only ours. They bind us to other people who trust the steadiness of institutions, contracts, and promises. I did not become someone else in the aftermath. I remained a woman who loved a man who taught her to plan for the inconvenient, who taught her that quiet use of resources can be a form of love. The will sentence gave me a chance to do what he would have wanted, protect the company he built, secure the livelihoods of the people who depend on it, and use what remained to help others who might one day find themselves vulnerable. The Whitaker Legacy Fund now offers small grants and legal referrals for people facing family financial coercion. We run workshops that fill slowly and build momentum. We hold a small fund for emergency payroll for small businesses in crisis, when owners die or are incapacitated, and no clear succession exists. The work is modest, focused, and practical. Exactly the sort of thing Floyd would have liked. Some mornings, when the light is thin and the roses in the garden are wet with dew, I sit at the kitchen table and write letters. Not to the sons, not to Bianca, but to people who need help. I sign them simply, with a strong hand that has learned the weight of small choices. I do not write to boast. I write because doing small things with intention matters. There is a sentence in a will that changed who got everything. That sentence gave me choice, and I used that choice to protect more than myself. In the quiet that follows, I have found a life that is not the life I expected after a marriage ended by death, but it is a life stitched with purpose. Gardens that grow, a company steady enough to pay its workers, a fund that helps someone else stand up when they've been pushed down. That feels like enough. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever watched someone take advantage of grief or suspicion in a family, share your thoughts below. And if you want, watch the 2 stories linked on the end screen about other people who used evidence and quiet planning to protect what mattered. I promise you this. Grief can narrow you to a task that becomes a kind of grace. The rest is work.